So we're going to go to Jennifer over in New Hampshire. Hey there. Wait, crap. Hold on. I hit the button, but it didn't hit. Hey there, Jennifer. How you doing?
Hi, how are you guys?
Doing all right.
Good. I have a question for Dr. Josh. I know that John takes the mythicist position that Jesus didn't ever exist, but I wondered if, I saw Dr. Josh's wife do the moderation between Dr. Ehrman and Dr. Lacona, and she did a really great job, by the way. And I wondered if Dr. Josh thought that there was ever a preacher named Jesus that ever existed. Not that he was divine, but if a Jewish preacher named Jesus ever existed.
Yeah, I mean, when this question is asked, like I do with so many other things, I say like the New Testament's not my area of expertise. So in the end, I would end up going with just what consensus scholarship says about it, or the majority of scholars say about that. So as I understand it, the position is that there was a guy named Jesus that existed in the first century. I think ultimately, I guess what I say about this is I don't know how much it matters too terribly much as far as this, debate about whether Jesus was divine or not, because, Naram Sin, as I think Megan asked this question in the debate, Naram Sin in the 24th century BCE existed and, was said to have been divine, and we have a lot more evidence of his divination than, or of his, being made into a deity than we do of anything surrounding Jesus. And nobody would argue that Naram Sin was made divine, as a god over the city of Agade. But the reason I think is obvious. But yeah, so that was sort of a roundabout way of saying I'm probably not the person to ask, because I'm just going to turn and say, well, what is it that most scholars say about this? Sorry.
I think most scholars say that he did exist, but it's a mythicist position that's a minority opinion, is from what my understanding is.
Yeah, and I would agree with Josh on the idea that whether or not Jesus existed doesn't really have anything to do with his divinity. Because even on my position, I feel like Paul initially thought of Jesus as divine in some kind of fashion. So as far as like whether or not Jesus was divine or what Jesus said about his divinity, I don't think that whether or not he existed really factors into it. So, but yeah, and I totally respect anybody that, isn't a mythicist and doesn't take the position and goes with the consensus, because I mean, that is the consensus position. I just so happen to disagree with it vigorously.
Well, I don't think he was divine. I'm an atheist. I don't think he was divine, but I do think that there's evidence for a Jewish preacher named Jesus who was an apocalypticist that actually existed, but I don't think he was divine. And he sure didn't rise today.
Right. Well, for me, the way that I come about the question, or I approach the question, is in a similar way to whether or not God exists. And that's that if I'm going to say that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher that, had disciples and whatnot, I would like to have some evidence that was actually true. And I personally am not convinced by the current arguments for the consensus on that. And so until I can figure out like how the current evidence definitely proves that, then I'll remain skeptical on that point. But I'm always up for learning, and always up to be shown that I'm wrong. But I've not found anybody to give me good evidence to tell me that I'm wrong. I get, I could say this for a different call or something like that, but I'm very different from most atheists, I guess, on this particular question.
Right. Even though the majority consensus is that somehow do have proof, whether they're religious or not, but they don't have proof, but I mean, they have reason to believe that he existed more than reason to believe that he did not exist. You still don't believe that he existed?
Well, I mean, when I take a look at the evidence that they say shows he existed, I'm not convinced by it. And I feel like the consensus should be backed by good evidence. And the evidence that they always propose is just not compelling to me. And so that does mean that I am going against the consensus, which I'm perfectly fine with because I feel like I can meet the burden of proof for my position. But just putting this out there, not even Bart Ehrman would say that the whole consensus idea proves that Jesus existed. I feel like appealing to consensus. Yeah. Well, I feel like appealing to consensus in this situation is more of like a thought stopping technique rather than any kind of useful like argument. I think that, stating that something is the consensus of mainstream people is valuable. But since I am contesting the evidence that they present, I feel like it's kind of a moot point to suggest that, that there's this consensus. And so you should believe it based on the consensus alone. I feel like we have to actually look at the historical information, like what evidence are they suggesting actually proves that Jesus did exist in the past. And more specifically, my position is I think that he probably didn't exist. I still think that there's a possibility, of him existing, and it's under certain understandings, it's even plausible. I mean, obviously it's plausible. It's just how plausible is it to me?
Right. And Dr. Josh thought he probably did exist. I guess I didn't understand his reply.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime that I'm not a specialist or have what I would consider requisite training in a particular topic that is at least highly debated online, I tend to be very careful about how I answer that question. Usually the way that I do it is I say, what is the consensus position among scholars, if there is one? And it seems like in this case, the consensus position is that Jesus was a real person that walked around in the first century as an apocalyptic preacher. And so I would agree with that position. Excuse me, but that's not coming from like my own research. It's just coming from that's what the consensus position is. And I think that's a reasonable way to approach these things.
Right. Okay. Well, that was just my question. I just wondered what both of your opinions were.
All right. Well, thank you for calling in. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. I hope you have a good night.
You too.
I dropped her call and she said you too right at the end. Anyways, but I'm perfectly fine with people taking the consensus position on it. But just knowing that, just throwing the consensus in my direction is not going to convince me just because I challenge the evidence. And that's the thing that really gets me is I already know that I'm challenging the consensus. So it kind of seems like, moot to challenge me with, but the consensus says,
I think it's just because John, I think it's just because you don't admit that dogs can't, come from non-dogs. I mean, that's
I'm just here to
all
help.
about,